Some numbers stay with you. Not because they're large. Because they're small. $199. That's what she refused to pay. Not because she couldn't. She arrived that morning in a car worth $400,000. Her watch alone could have paid that bill 40 times over. Her company, a real estate empire stretching across 7 states, turned over more money in a single hour than that invoice represented in a lifetime. $199. For a man who had worked through the night. Who had left his sleeping son in the care of a neighbor at 2 in the morning. Who had driven 20 miles in the rain with his tools in a truck that needed new tires. Who had fixed her car so she could make a meeting that would close a deal worth millions. $199. She looked at the invoice. She looked at him, the grease on his hands, the tired lines around his eyes, the worn jacket with a child's drawing tucked in the breast pocket. And she decided he was someone she didn't have to pay. She was wrong. She was so profoundly, completely, life-changingly wrong. Music swells, then cuts to absolute silence. Because standing 20 feet behind her, watching every second of what she did, was her father. And her father knew exactly who that mechanic was. His name was James Calloway. 38 years old. Single father of an 8-year-old boy named Eli. He ran a one-man mobile mechanic service out of a white pickup truck with 212,000 miles on it, a magnetic sign on the door that read, "Calloway Auto, we come to you," and a toolbox that was worth more than anything else he owned. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Hargrove, a mid-sized city in Georgia where the gap between the wealthy neighborhoods in the west and the working neighborhoods in the east was measured not just in miles but in worlds. The apartment was clean. Always clean. James had a thing about cleanliness that came from raising a child alone, the understanding that the one thing you could always control, when everything else felt out of control, was whether the floors were swept and the dishes were done. Eli's drawings covered the refrigerator. 27 of them, by last count, cars, mostly, because Eli had grown up understanding that cars were the language his father spoke. Trucks, engines, racing cars, flying cars, cars with faces. One drawing, in the center of the refrigerator, slightly larger than the others, showed a man and a small boy standing next to a pickup truck. Underneath, in the careful handwriting of a child who had recently learned to spell, "Me and Alibaba fixing the world." James had framed that one in his mind, even if he hadn't framed it on the wall. He had not planned to be a mobile mechanic. He had planned, once, in a life that felt like it belonged to a different person, to be an engineer. He had the mind for it. His high school physics teacher, a man named Mr. Okafor, had told him once that he had the kind of mechanical intuition that couldn't be taught, only found, and that he should do something with it that the world would remember. He had enrolled in a 2-year automotive engineering program at a technical college. He had been good, genuinely, remarkably good. His instructors noticed. His classmates noticed. There was talk of a scholarship to a 4-year program. There was talk of a future that looked very different from the east side of Hargrove. And then Eli's mother left. Not dramatically. Not with a fight. She simply left. A note on the kitchen table. An empty closet. A 3-year-old boy standing in the hallway holding a stuffed rabbit and looking at his father with eyes that asked a question James would spend the rest of his life answering. "Are you still here?" "I'm still here." He dropped out of the engineering program. Not because he had to, his mother offered to help, his friends offered to help, but because he looked at that 3-year-old boy and understood, in the deepest part of himself, that Eli needed one constant, unmovable, always present thing in his life. And James chose to be that thing. He took his skills, the mechanical intuition Mr. Okafor had said couldn't be taught, and he built something practical with them. A mobile mechanic service. Low overhead. Flexible hours so he could do school drop-offs and pickups. Work that could be paused when Eli was sick and resumed when he wasn't. It was not the life he had planned. But it was a life he had chosen. Deliberately. Eyes open. For Eli. He built a reputation slowly, the way honest businesses are always built, one job at a time, one satisfied customer at a time, one referral at a time. He was reliable. He was skilled far beyond what anyone expected from a mobile mechanic. He showed up when he said he would show up. He charged what he said he would charge. He explained what he was doing and why. In 5 years, he had built a small but loyal customer base, mostly working families who couldn't afford dealership prices and didn't have time to sit in a shop waiting room. He wasn't getting rich. But he was keeping the lights on, keeping Eli in clean clothes and good food, and keeping the truck running. Some months were better than others. The month this story begins was one of the harder ones. A large job had fallen through, a fleet contract with a local delivery company that had ultimately gone to a larger shop. 3 smaller jobs had been canceled by customers who suddenly couldn't afford repairs. The truck needed new tires that James had been putting off for 2 weeks because the timing wasn't right. On the evening of the 14th of November, James sat at the kitchen table after Eli was asleep, looking at his accounting spreadsheet with the particular stillness of a man doing the mathematics of survival. His phone rang at 11:47 p.m. A number he didn't recognize. Area code he didn't know. He almost didn't answer. But late-night calls sometimes meant emergency roadside work, and emergency roadside work paid a premium. He picked up. "Is this Callaway Auto?" A woman's voice. Clipped, impatient, with the particular edge of someone accustomed to being responded to immediately regardless of the hour. "This is James Callaway, yes. My car won't start. I'm in the Hargrove Grand Hotel parking garage. I need someone now." "Ma'am, it's almost midnight. I'm aware of the time. I have a 7 a.m. meeting that I cannot miss. I need the car working before then. Can you do it or not?" James thought about the spreadsheet on his kitchen table. "What's the vehicle?" 2024 Bentley Continental GT Black. James was quiet for a moment. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. He called his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a retired schoolteacher who had an arrangement with James that she never complained about and he never took for granted, and asked if she could sit with Eli. She came over in her housecoat without a word of complaint, settled into the armchair with her knitting, and waved him out the door. James drove to the Hargrove Grand Hotel in the rain, his windshield wipers working hard, the truck tires he kept meaning to replace hissing on the wet road. He found the Bentley on level 2 of the parking garage. He diagnosed the problem in 11 minutes, a failed battery management system module compounded by a parasitic drain from a faulty rear entertainment module that had been drawing power continuously. Both issues needed to be addressed or the repair wouldn't hold. He worked for 3 hours and 40 minutes. In a parking garage. At 2 in the morning. On his knees on concrete. In a jacket that wasn't quite warm enough. At 3:52 a.m., the Bentley's engine turned over with the smooth, refined purr of a car that cost more than most people's houses. James packed his tools, wrote up the invoice, parts and labor, 3 hours 40 minutes of emergency nighttime work, and totaled it. $199. He had deliberately kept it low. The parts cost was minimal, the module was something he kept in stock. The labor rate he charged was his standard rate, not the emergency premium he could have justified. He wasn't sure why, exactly. Something about the way the night felt. Something about wanting the job done right and the invoice fair. He took a photograph of the completed work, as he always did, and sent the invoice to the number that had called him. Then he leaned against his truck and waited. She arrived at 6:45 a.m. Victoria Crane. 35 years old. CEO of Crane Development Group, a real estate empire founded by her father, Richard Crane, that had spent 40 years building, acquiring, and developing commercial and residential properties across the southeastern United States. Under Victoria's leadership for the past 4 years, the company had expanded aggressively, doubling its portfolio and tripling its revenue. She was brilliant. Nobody disputed that. She had an MBA from Wharton, a legal mind that could dismantle a contract in 20 minutes, and a strategic instinct that had closed deals her father's generation would have considered impossible. She was also, and this was less discussed in the business press that profiled her, the kind of person who had somewhere along the way confused wealth with worth. Who had learned to sort the world into people who mattered and people who served, and had stopped being curious about which category she'd put someone in before she'd actually looked at them. She came down to the parking garage in a camel coat and heels, her assistant behind her with a tablet, already reciting the morning schedule. She saw James standing by her car. She saw the truck with the magnetic sign. She saw the worn jacket and the tool case and the tired eyes of a man who had worked through the night. She took the invoice he offered. She looked at it. $199. And something happened in her face, a calculation, quick and cold, and she handed it back to him. "I'm not paying this," she said. James looked at her. "I'm sorry?" The car was a simple battery issue. "You've overcharged." "Ma'am, it was a battery management module failure and a parasitic drain from the rear entertainment system. I have the diagnostic report." "I don't need a lecture," she said, already moving toward the car. "I'll have my company's automotive vendor look at it. If your work holds up, we'll discuss payment." "That's not how this works," James said, quietly. "The work is done. The invoice is due." Victoria stopped. Turned. Looked at him with the particular expression of someone unaccustomed to being addressed as an equal by someone they've already categorized. "Are you seriously going to argue with me in a parking garage at 6:45 in the morning?" "I'm going to ask you to pay the invoice," James said. Same quiet voice. Same steady eyes. $199 for 3 hours and 40 minutes of emergency work that got your car running for your 7 a.m. meeting. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she got into the Bentley, started the engine James had spent 3 hours and 40 minutes on his knees repairing, and drove away. James stood in the parking garage. He looked at the invoice in his hand. He looked at the tire tracks the Bentley had left on the wet concrete as it drove out. He thought about the spreadsheet on his kitchen table. About Eli's drawing on the refrigerator. About Mrs. Patterson sitting in the armchair in her housecoat so he could come here and do this. He folded the invoice. Put it in his breast pocket, next to the drawing of Eli's he always carried. Picked up his tool case. And he walked back to his truck. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't call anyone. He drove home in the rain, replaced Mrs. Patterson with a quiet thank you, checked that Eli was still asleep, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee until it was time to make breakfast. Long pause. Music almost silent. What James did not know, could not have known, was that he had not been alone in that parking garage. He had not seen the black town car parked in the shadow of the far corner of level 2. He had not seen the elderly man inside it, who had arrived at the hotel the previous evening for the same morning meeting his daughter was attending, and who had not been able to sleep, and who had come down to the garage at 5 a.m. to sit in his car and think, as he often did when something weighed on him. He had not seen that man watching James work, watching the invoice exchange, watching Victoria drive away, watching James stand alone in the empty parking garage, fold the invoice, and walk to his truck without a word. The elderly man's name was Richard Crane. And he had seen everything. Richard Crane was 68 years old, and he had built everything from nothing. Not the comfortable kind of nothing where there's a safety net below and someone who'll catch you if you fall. The real kind. The kind where there is no net, no catcher, no floor. He had grown up in rural Alabama, the son of a sharecropper and a seamstress, in a house with 3 rooms and 7 people and a father who worked himself into an early grave doing work that other men profited from. He had watched his father, a man of enormous dignity and quiet strength, be cheated by landowners, dismissed by employers, underpaid by merchants who knew he had no alternative. His father had never raised his voice about it. He had simply worked. And raised his children. And maintained his dignity with a completeness that Richard, as a child, couldn't understand, but as an old man, understood completely. Richard had left Alabama at 17 with $40 and a clarity of purpose that had never left him. He had worked construction, then property management, then real estate sales, saving every cent with a discipline that bordered on asceticism. At 26, he had bought his first property, a small commercial unit in a declining neighborhood that everyone told him was a mistake. It was not a mistake. 40 years later, Crane Development Group was one of the most significant real estate companies in the southeastern United States. But Richard Crane had never forgotten where he came from. Had never forgotten his father's face after a long day of being cheated by someone who thought dignity was negotiable. Had never forgotten the feeling of doing honest work and being told it wasn't worth paying for. He had instilled this in Victoria, or tried to. He had tried to teach her that businesses were built on people, that the person who showed up at midnight in the rain with their tools was the foundation of everything, that you never looked down at someone whose hands were doing work yours couldn't. He thought he had succeeded. Watching from the shadow of his town car at 6:45 in the morning, he understood that he had not. His driver, Marcus, had seen it too. Neither of them said anything as Victoria's Bentley drove past them and up the exit ramp. Richard sat in the back seat and looked at the empty space where James Calloway's truck had been. "Marcus," he said finally. "Sir." "The man with the truck. Did you get the name from the sign?" "Calloway Auto, sir." "Find him," Richard said. "Before 9 a.m. James made pancakes. He always made pancakes on mornings after hard nights, not because it was a tradition he had consciously established, but because pancakes were the thing his mother had made for him when things were difficult, and some comforts pass between generations without anyone deciding to pass them. Eli came out of his bedroom at 7:15 in the dinosaur pajamas that were slightly too small now but that he refused to give up, rubbing his eyes and following his nose to the kitchen. He climbed onto his chair at the kitchen table and looked at his father, the tired eyes, the still clean jacket hanging by the door, the coffee cup that had clearly been there since before sunrise. "Did you have a job last night?" Eli asked. "Yep," James said, sliding pancakes onto his plate. "Did it go okay?" James looked at his son. 8 years old. Sarah's eyes. His own quietness. "It went fine," he said. "Eat your pancakes." Eli poured syrup with the focused generosity of a child who has not yet learned to be sparing with good things. He ate 2 bites. Then looked up. "Baba, is today a good money day or a hard money day?" James stopped. He and Eli had developed this language between them, not because James had ever intended to involve his 8-year-old in the economics of their life, but because Eli was perceptive in the way children raised in honest households are perceptive, and pretending hadn't seemed fair. In between, James said. Eli nodded seriously. Ate another bite of pancake. That's okay, he said. In between days always turn into something. James looked at his son for a moment. Where did you get that? Eli shrugged. You said it once. I remembered. James didn't remember saying it. But he was glad, suddenly, that he had. He dropped Eli at school at 8:15, watched him run through the gate with his backpack bouncing, and drove back toward the east side of Hargrove with the specific weight of a man deciding what to do next. His phone rang at 8:47. Unknown number. Different from last night's. Landline area code. Mr. Calloway? Speaking. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Richard Crane. Mr. Crane would like to meet with you this morning, if you're available. He says it concerns a matter from earlier today. James was quiet for a moment. Richard Crane, he said. The developer. Yes, sir. Why? A brief pause. He'd prefer to explain in person, Mr. Calloway. He's at the Hargrove Grand Hotel. He can make himself available at any time convenient to you. James pulled his truck to the side of the road. He thought about the parking garage. About the invoice. About driving home in the rain. Tell him 10 o'clock, James said. Thank you, Mr. Calloway. We'll see you then. Before I tell you what happened when James Calloway walked into that hotel, and I promise you, what happens in that room will change the way you see everything that came before it. Welcome to the Single Brave Dad Stories, the channel where we tell the stories of the fathers the world forgets to honor. The ones who work through the night and make pancakes in the morning and never stop showing up. If this story is speaking to something in you right now, hit that like button. It costs you nothing and it means everything to us. And if you haven't joined our family yet, subscribe to the Single Brave Dad Stories right now and ring that notification bell. Every day we bring you a story that reminds you, the quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones with grease on their hands and children waiting at home. They are the strongest people in the world. Now, let's go back to that hotel. The Hargrove Grand Hotel's lobby looked like a different planet from the parking garage 2 levels below it. Marble floors. Fresh flowers. The particular quality of air that expensive hotels cultivate, slightly cooler than outside, slightly scented, as though discomfort has been architecturally excluded. James walked through it in his clean jacket. He had gone home and changed, because he was his mother's son and his mother had taught him that you showed up to important things presentably regardless of how tired you were. Marcus, the driver, met him at the entrance and led him to a private meeting room on the 2nd floor. Richard Crane was already there. Seated at a round table. No assistants. No lawyers. No entourage. Just an old man in a good suit, with large hands and the kind of face that has been weathered by decades of real decisions, not the polished, managed face of corporate portraiture, but the actual face of a man who had built things and lost things and learned things. He stood when James entered. Extended his hand. Mr. Calloway. Thank you for coming. Please sit down. They sat across from each other. Richard looked at him for a moment with the directness of a man who had spent 68 years deciding which people were worth his full attention. I was in the parking garage this morning, Richard said. Level 2. I saw what happened. James said nothing. Waited. I saw you work, Richard continued. I was there from approximately 2 a.m. I couldn't sleep. I saw you arrive. I watched you diagnose and repair the vehicle. I saw the invoice exchange. I saw my daughter drive away. Still James said nothing. I want to say something to you, Richard said, and I want you to let me finish before you respond. All right, James said. Richard leaned forward slightly. I built my company over 40 years. Not because I was the smartest person in the room. Not because I had advantages, I didn't. I built it because of people. Specifically, people like you. People who showed up. Who did the work. Who charged a fair price and kept their word and maintained their dignity when the world gave them every reason not to. He paused. I watched you stand in that garage after my daughter drove away. I watched you fold that invoice and put it in your pocket and pick up your tools and walk to your truck. You didn't shout. You didn't call anyone. You just left. Another pause. Longer. My father was a man like you, Richard said quietly. He spent his life doing honest work for people who underpaid him and dismissed him and drove away. He never complained. He just kept going. For us. For his children. James looked at the old man across the table. And for the first time since 2 a.m. in a parking garage, he felt something loosen slightly in his chest. I have a business proposition for you, Richard said. But before I make it, I want to give you something. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. He slid it across the table. "That's a check," Richard said. "I'd like you to open it." James looked at the envelope. Then at Richard. Then he picked it up, opened it, and unfolded the check inside. He read the number. He read it again. His face didn't change, not immediately. But something behind his eyes did. Something that had been holding very tightly, for a very long time, shifted. $19 million. "That's not a mistake," Richard said, reading his expression. "And it's not charity. Let me explain what it is." Richard Crane had spent the morning on the phone. Not reacting. Planning. He had called his CFO, his legal team, and 2 members of his board. He had also called a private investigator he had used for due diligence purposes for 15 years, and asked for a background summary on a mobile mechanic in Hargrove named James Calloway. What came back in 40 minutes had confirmed what Richard had already sensed watching that parking garage. James Calloway. Formerly enrolled in automotive engineering, academic record that one of Richard's contacts at the technical college described, privately, as genuinely exceptional, the kind of student you remember. Dropped out to raise his son alone. Built a mobile mechanic business from nothing. 5-year track record of 0 complaints, consistent 5-star customer reviews, and a reputation in Hargrove's working community as the most honest mechanic in the city. 0 debt default. 0 legal issues. And one other thing, a detail that the investigator had included almost as an aside but that Richard had read 3 times. James Calloway had, 18 months ago, identified and reported a gas leak in an apartment building on Crane Development Group's East Hargrove portfolio, a building James had been called to for a vehicle repair in the adjacent parking lot. He had noticed the smell, traced it, knocked on the superintendent's door, and insisted the building be evacuated until the gas company arrived. 47 families had been in that building. The gas company had confirmed a significant leak in a main line. James had never mentioned it to anyone. Never sought recognition. Never contacted Crane Development Group to say what he had done. He had just done it. Because it was right. And then driven to his next job. Richard had sat with that information for a long time. Now he sat across from James Calloway in a hotel meeting room and explained what $19 million meant. Crane Development Group has a commercial property portfolio in East Hargrove, Richard said. 17 properties. Warehouses, light industrial units, a mixed-use development we've been planning for 3 years that's never found the right anchor. I've been looking for the right partner, not an investor, a partner, to take over operations and development of that portfolio. Someone with roots in that community. Someone with integrity. Someone who understands what it means to build something from nothing. He looked at James steadily. The $19 million is the initial capitalization for a joint venture. Crane Development provides the assets, the infrastructure, the legal and financial framework. You provide the operational leadership, the community relationships, and the thing that cannot be bought or hired, the character to run it right. James was very still. "Mr. Crane," he said carefully. "I'm a mechanic." "You're an engineer who chose to be a mechanic because your son needed you," Richard said. "That's a different thing entirely. I have no experience in real estate development. I have people who know real estate development. I don't need another one of those." Richard leaned forward. "I need someone who will knock on a door at 2 in the morning and stay until the job is done. Who will charge a fair price. Who the people in that community will trust because he's one of them and they know it. Who won't drive away without paying the person who worked through the night." Silence. The particular silence of a moment that both people in the room understood was significant. "Why?" James said finally. Not challenging. Genuinely asking. Richard looked at him for a long moment. "Because my father deserved better than he got," he said quietly. "And I have spent 40 years trying to be the kind of person who makes sure men like him, men like you, get what they deserve." He paused. "And because 47 families in an East Hargrove apartment building went home to their children 18 months ago because you smelled gas and knocked on a door. And you never told anyone." James looked at the old man. "You know about that." "I know about that." A long pause. "My daughter doesn't know I'm here," Richard said. "This decision is mine. The proposition is real. The check is real. And the answer, that's yours." James looked down at the check on the table between them. He thought about a spreadsheet. About hard money days and in-between days. About pancakes and dinosaur pajamas and a drawing on the refrigerator that said, "Me and Ali Baba fixing the world." He thought about his father Raymond, who had told him once that the most important things you ever build are the things you build for other people. He looked up at Richard Crane. "I'll need to think about it," James said. "And I'll need to talk to my son." Richard nodded. Slowly. With the respect of a man who recognizes a right answer when he hears one. "Take the time you need," he said. The proposition doesn't expire. He stood. Extended his hand. James stood and shook it. One more thing, Richard said. The $199. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his wallet. He placed two $100 bills on the table. James looked at them. Keep the change, Richard said. And for the first time since 2 a.m. in a parking garage on the 14th of November, James Calloway smiled. Victoria Crane found out what her father had done 3 days later. Not because Richard told her, he hadn't. But because in a company where her father still held the majority interest and the ear of the board, a $19 million joint venture capitalization did not go unnoticed by the finance team, and the finance team's questions eventually reached her desk. She sat in her office and read the term sheet. James Calloway. East Hargrove Portfolio. Joint venture. $19 million. She read it twice. Then she called her father. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting the call. You saw, she said. I saw, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Victoria Crane was not a person who found silence uncomfortable. She used it, strategically, as a negotiating tool. But this silence was different. This was the silence of a person confronting something about themselves that they would have preferred not to confront. The mechanic from the garage. His name is James Calloway, her father said. He has an 8-year-old son named Eli. He spent 3 hours and 40 minutes on his knees in a parking garage in the rain at 2 in the morning fixing your car. He charged you $199. She said nothing. 18 months ago, Richard continued, he noticed a gas leak in one of our East Hargrove buildings. He evacuated the building himself and called the gas company. 47 families. He never contacted us. Never asked for anything. The silence stretched. Victoria, her father said, and his voice had the tone it had used when she was a child and had done something that disappointed him, not angry, never angry, but carrying a weight that was somehow harder to bear than anger. I have watched you build something remarkable. You are extraordinary at what you do. But somewhere along the way you stopped seeing people. Dad. Not an accusation. An observation. From someone who loves you. A pause. The people who show up at midnight. The people who charge a fair price. The people who fix the leak and don't ask for credit, those people are not beneath you. They are the reason you have anything to stand on. She was quiet for a long time. Is there anything I should do? She asked finally. Richard thought about it. That, he said, is between you and your conscience. She drove to the east side of Hargrove the following morning. She found the white pickup truck with the magnetic sign outside an apartment complex. She sat in her Bentley for 10 minutes before getting out. She walked to the truck. She waited. James came out of the building carrying his tool case, stopped when he saw her, and looked at her with the same steady, quiet eyes she remembered from the parking garage. She reached into her coat pocket and produced an envelope. This is the original invoice, she said. Plus interest. And, she paused. I'm sorry. For the parking garage. For how I treated you. It was wrong. James looked at her for a moment. Then he took the envelope. Thank you, he said. She nodded. Turned to go. Miss Crane. She stopped. Your father, James said. He's a good man. She turned back. And for just a moment, something in her face shifted, something cracked open slightly, the way expensive surfaces crack when something real presses against them. I know, she said. I'm trying to remember what that means. She got back into the Bentley and drove away. This time, James watched her go without the weight he'd carried before. 1 year after a parking garage at 2 in the morning, the East Hargrove mixed-use development broke ground. James Calloway stood at the groundbreaking in a jacket that was new, not expensive, just new, with Eli beside him in his school uniform, slightly too excited to stand still, holding a small ceremonial shovel that the construction company had made especially for him. The development would bring 420 jobs to the east side of Hargrove. Affordable commercial spaces for small businesses. Community facilities. A park. Richard Crane was there. He stood a little apart from the crowd, watching, the way men who have built things sometimes watch the next generation begin to build, with a satisfaction that doesn't require ceremony. Davis, the reporter from the Hargrove Gazette who was covering the groundbreaking, asked James how he had come to be involved in a $19 million development venture. James thought about how to answer. I fixed a car, he said finally. And I charged a fair price. Davis wrote it down, slightly confused. Later, after the cameras had gone and the crowd had thinned, Eli tugged his father's jacket. Baba, he said. Is today a good money day? James looked at his son. At the construction site behind him. At the east side of Hargrove, the neighborhood where they lived, where he had built his business job by job, where 47 families had gone home to their children because he had knocked on a door. Today, he said, is the best kind of day. What kind is that? James picked up his son, the small, serious, dinosaur pajama-wearing, syrup-generous boy who had sat across a kitchen table and told him that in-between days always turned into something. The kind, James said, where the work finally speaks loud enough for everyone to hear. $199. That's where this story began. One man. One invoice. One decision by one woman who looked at him and decided he didn't matter. And one old man, sitting in a dark town car, who had spent his whole life watching men like James Calloway be dismissed, and who had decided, finally, that this time would be different. The world is full of James Calloways. Men who work through the night and make pancakes in the morning. Who fold the invoice and put it in their pocket next to their child's drawing. Who knock on doors and fix leaks and charge fair prices and maintain their dignity with a completeness that the comfortable world cannot understand. They are not invisible. They just haven't been seen yet. Until the right person looks. If this story reached something inside you, if you know a James Calloway, or if you are a James Calloway, please give this video a thumbs up right now. Subscribe to the Single Brave Dad Stories, ring that notification bell, and come back every day for the stories that remind us who the real builders of this world are. They're not always in the boardrooms. Sometimes they're in the parking garage. At 2 in the morning. In the rain. With grease on their hands and a child's drawing in their pocket. Stay brave. Stay honest. Keep showing up,